네, 오늘의 행사는 탈인지라고 한국에 번역된 책, 이렇게 생긴 책인데요. 네, 탈인지 잘 안 보이네요. 네, 이런 책인데 이 책의 한국어판 출간을 기념하는 저자 스티븐 샤비로님의 전 지구 인터넷 화상 강연입니다. 우선 오늘 사회를 맡게 된 저는 김미정이라고 하고요. 그리고 다중지성예정원에서 공부하고 있고 문학평론, 문학연구 등을 하고 있습니다. 그리고 오늘의 이제 또 전반적으로 아주 중요한 역할을 해주실 통역하실 분이 여기 갈무리 출판사 활동가이신 김정현 님이시고요. 정현 님이 계속 통역을 좀 해주실 것입니다. 그리고 오늘 아마 미리 받으셨거나 여기 링크로 파일을 공유해 드릴 것 같은데 이 번역문, 그러니까 강연문을 번역하신 것은 저자인 안호성님께서 번역을 해주셨습니다. 네, 감사드립니다. 우선 못 받으신 강연문을 혹시 못 받으신 분께서는 여기 아마 링크가 올라올 것 같고요. 원문과 한글본이 같이 올라올 것 같습니다. 오늘의 행사는 전반부에서 한 50분 정도는 샤비로님의 영어 강연을 듣는 것으로 하고요. 그리고 아마 스크립터는 직접 조작을 해주시는 거죠. 화면에 띄워놓고. 네, 그렇게 해주실 것 같고, 그리고 한 10분 정도 쉬는 시간을 가졌다가 12시 정도부터는 이제 또 본격적인 여기 계신 분들의 질의응답을 이어가는 시간으로 하겠습니다. 그리고 원활한 진행을 위해서 전체 여기 계신 분들께서는 음소거를 꼭 확인해 주시기를 부탁드리고요. 네, 지금 이제 시작을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 강연자 소개 간단하게 먼저 좀 해보겠습니다. 스티븐 샤비로님은 한국에도 사물들의 우주 책 번역으로 먼저 익히 알려져 계셨고요. 그리고 지금 현재 미국의 철학자이고 문화 비평가로 활동하고 계십니다. 그리고 81년도에 예일대학에서 박사학위 취득하셨고 현재는 웨인 주립대학의 영어학과 드로이 교수로 재직 중이십니다. 그리고 주요 연구의 관심사가 영화 이론, 그리고 시간, 미학, 과학소설, 범심론, 자본주의, 정동, 주체성 이런 키워드로 작업을 계속 해오고 계셨고요. 그리고 저서를 간단하게라도 좀 그래도 소개를 해드리면 계신 분들이 계신 분들의 이해를 좀 도울 수 있지 않을까 해가지고요. 제가 간단하게 그냥 목록을 채팅창에 띄워놓을까 합니다. 네, 이런 목록인데 1990년도에 패션 앤 액세스라고 하는 책에서 블랑쇼나 바타요 그리고 문학 이론 등을 좀 다루셨던 일이 있고, 그리고 1993년도에 영화 이론서 더 시네마틱 바디라고 하는 책을 내셨습니다. 그리고 이 책은 락강적인 레토릭들이 현대 영화학계에서, 그러니까 당시의 영화학계에서 지배적이었었던 경향들을 검토하고 계시는 책으로 알고 있는데, 한국에서도 개인적으로는 아마 00년대, 2000년대 즈음이 이런 경향성이 좀 두드러지지 않았나 싶어서 이 책도 개인적으로 무척 관심이 있기도 합니다. 그 다음에 97년도에 둠 페트롤스라고 하는 책을 내셨고, 이거는 당시에 이제 90년대 초에 포스트 모더니즘의 상황을 개괄하면서 이론 픽션을 표방했던 그런 작품입니다. 그리고 2009년에 쓴 책으로 곧 이제 갈무리에서 또 이제 나올 책인데요. 기준 없이라고 아마 제목이 이제 나갈 것 같습니다. 그리고 부제로 칸트, 화이트헤드, 들레즈 그리고 미학. 근데 이 책의 취지가 저도 보지는 못했지만 화이트헤드가 그러니까 하이데거의 현재의 철학사적인 위치를 대체한 세계, 이런 것을 아마 상상하는 그런 책인 것 같습니다. 그리고 사물들의 우주가 작년에 갈무리에서 번역이 됐고요. 이 책은 사변적 실제론 그리고 화이트헤드의 철학 등을 다루는 책이었습니다. 그리고 2016년도의 책이 지금 이 탈이라고 한국에 번역된 이번에 이제 출간 기념을 맞은 이 책이고요. 이 책은 2017년도에 과학소설과 기술문화 연구상이라는 상을 수상했다라고 합니다. 그리고 2017년도에는 샤비로님이 아마도 예술 형식으로서의 뮤직비디오 관련 작업을 방대한 작업을 하고 계시는데 그와 관련된 책을 내셨고, 그리고 2021년도 그러니까 작년에 새로운 책 포스트 시네마틱 어펙트라고 하는 책을 내신 일이 있습니다. 뒤에 그 부제들도 참고해 주시면 좋을 것 같고요. 그리고 역시나 그 본격적인 강연을 듣기 전에 간단하게나마 책 소개를 좀 해드릴까 합니다. 그 책은 제가 아까 잠시 보여드렸지만 네, 잘 안 보이네요. 지금 연두색 책이고요. 탈인지 디스커그니션이라고 하는 책이 이제 탈인지라고 번역되어서 지금 우리 앞에 놓여 있고, 이 책에서는 다양한 존재자가 세계를 바라보는 방식에 대해서 쓰여져 있습니다. 그리고 그 다양한 세계를 바라보는 방식들이 그러니까 인간의 그 방식과는 매우 다르다라고 하는 것, 이것을 이제 텍스트를 통해서 관점주의 방식으로 다루고 있는 그런 책입니다. 이 책은 이제 이런 질문으로부터 시작을 할 것 같습니다. 식물과 아메바도 생각을 할까? 또는 뭐 가령 우리가 외계인을 만났을 때 그들은 우리가 하는 얘기들을 이해할 수 있을까? 또는 그 토머스 네이글의 유명한 질문처럼 박쥐가 된다는 것은 어떤 것이고, 또 의식하고 생각하고 느끼고 알고 있다라고 하는 것은 무엇일까? 이것에 대한 이제 근본적인 질문들을 이 책에서 던지면서 시작을 한다라고 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그리고 이런 질문들은 사실 내내 철학이라든지 과학에서의 작업들이기도 했지만, 그 SF라고 하는 것이 일종의 사고 실험을 통해서 어떻게 이런 의문들에 탐구를 하는데 참고가 되는지, 이런 것들을 아주 집요하게 분석하고 계시는 그런 책인 것 같습니다. 그리고 이 책은 서론이 있고요. 그리고 7개의 장으로 구성되어 있고, 그리고 후기, 그리고 이제 그 2개의 부록이 덧붙여져 있는데, 그 세상의 이제 다양한 관점에서 인간의 관점이 아닌 그 존재자의 자리에서 본다라고 하는 게 이를테면 철학자, 컴퓨터, 아바타, 인간 존재, 살인마, 외계인, 점균, 이런 존재의 관점에서 생각한다라는 것을 내포하는 그런 분석의 책인 것 같습니다. 같습니다가 아니라 그런 분석의 책입니다. 그리고 여기에는 이제 부록들이 굉장히 참고가 되는 부록들이 실려 있고요. 특히 이제 한국어판에만 수록된 부록에는 그 샤비로님의 이제 화이트헤드 관련 논문도 굉장히 그 큰 의미를 지니고 있는 것 같습니다. 그 한국에 소개되지 않은 SF의 이 서지사항이라든지 레퍼런스라든지 이런 것들이 굉장히 유용하게 또 이 부록으로 있기도 해서, 이 책은 반드시 이제 문학이라든지 SF라든지 문화예술계뿐 아니라 뭐 철학 그리고 과학 등의 여러 학제간 그 사고의 사유에 아주 큰 자극이 되겠다, 이런 생각을 하면서 저도 좀 책을 봤던 것 같습니다. 네, 저의 이야기가 조금 길어진 것 같아서요. 빠르게 이제 강연자님을 모시고 강연을 들어야 될 것 같습니다. 여기 소리 모두 음소거를 하셔서 소리는 들리지 않겠지만 마음으로 또는 큰 박수, 각자 계신 자리에서의 큰 박수로 샤비로님을 모셔보도록 하겠습니다.
Okay. Should I start? Yes. Hello. I am honored to have my book Discognition translated into Korean. This is the second book of mine that has been translated and published by Galmuri Press. I thank the press for its efforts on my behalf, and I hope that Korean readers will find my book relevant and interesting. Translation is always a difficult process, and I myself do not speak or read Korean. It is always a reason for celebration when meanings and feelings are carried from one language to another, just as it is a reason for celebration when meanings and feelings are communicated from one brain and body to another through acts of speaking and listening or writing and reading. We tend to take translation for granted because we could not easily get things accomplished otherwise. But it is worth remembering that every successful transmission, every act of communication, and indeed every thought, is a small miracle. There is always a gap, whether between one neuron and another, or between one language and another, or between one body and another, or between the mouth and the ear, or between the page and the eye. In the broadest sense, translation is the act of crossing over these gaps. The title of my book, Discognition, is a made-up word that does not really exist in English. It combines the word cognition, which means, to cite a standard definition, the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. With the prefix dis, which implies negation or undoing. With this made-up word, I seek to designate the processes that both enable and limit cognition, and to describe how such processes work in a number of science fiction texts, plus a body of philosophical writing in the first chapter and a series of biological research papers in the last chapter. My starting point is the observation that not everything can be totally understood. There's always something more, something that is left out, something that escapes my comprehension. Although this more or extra is lost in translation, it still matters, and indeed it makes a substantial difference. As the poet says, so much depends upon it. When I try to describe an object, like a peach that I am about to eat or a ball that I'm about to throw, I always fall short. There are always aspects or qualities of the object that I have not managed to capture in words. For that matter, there are also aspects or qualities of the peach that are not entirely included in my delightful experience of eating it. And there are aspects or qualities of the ball that are not entirely included in the experience of throwing it and catching it. The American philosopher Graham Harman, some of whose books I have also, I believe, been translated into Korean by Galmuri Press, has written extensively about this. But I take my cues here mostly from the great German philosopher G.W. Leibniz, born 1646, died 1716. Leibniz was an early Enlightenment polymath whose interests were both detailed and universal. I will not attempt anything like a comprehensive discussion of Leibniz here. Indeed, I will go so far as to silently alter some of his ideas when doing so was useful for my own purposes. Leibniz is important to me because he maintains three principles and proposes three concepts that are crucial to my understanding of science fiction. The three principles are: 1, the identity of indiscernibles; 2, sufficient reason; 3, non-contradiction. And the three concepts are: 1, multiple perspectives; 2, possible worlds; 3, unity in diversity. In the first place, Leibniz insists on multiple perspectives. He maintains that each of us is what he calls a monad, a vital center of will and feeling, rooted in the world and yet self-enclosed and separate from the rest of the world. Modern biology tells us that all cells and all living things more generally are bounded by membranes which separate the inside from the outside and also selectively allow certain things, but not others, to pass between the inside and the outside. Leibniz knew little of what we now understand about biological cells. But he took a keen interest in the biology of his day, and especially in the work of his contemporary Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, the first person to observe unicellular organisms through a microscope. Leibniz anticipates later scientific findings in the way that he sees the cellular structure that he calls a monad is the basic unit of life and indeed of the world as a whole. For Leibniz, I am both an active part of the world and a detached spectator standing apart from the rest of the world. I occupy a specific location in the world which can be called my perspective or point of view, and I experience everything around me, everything that I encounter, from my own particular point of view. I see, hear, smell, touch, and taste various elements of the world. Indeed, I feel the world and all the things in the world. My cognition, my knowledge of the world is secondary to and dependent upon these ongoing processes of feeling or experiencing. Because of its dependence upon feeling, cognition is always finite, partial, and incomplete. My experiences go well beyond what I am directly cognizant of or what I can explain to myself. Indeed, my feelings and experiences are not necessarily immediate and conscious at all. Leibniz says that I mostly encounter the world in the form of small perceptions, petites perceptions in French, that fall beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. I do not experience these perceptions individually. I only notice their sum or their subsequent consequences. For instance, as Leibniz says, the confused murmur that people hear when nearing the seashore comes from the putting together of the reverberations of countless waves. I only hear the pounding of the waves as an overall sound, an aggregate. I do not hear in isolation any of the individual sounds made by each particular droplet of water. And yet Leibniz assures us that the aggregate sound that I hear is by no means uniform. For each individual drop of water is ever so subtly different from every other one. This is the basis of Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, which states that no two separate and distinct things can be entirely alike. Let me give another example, this time from one of Leibniz's successors, the modern British-American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, born in 1861, died in 1949. When I stand in the sun, I see the visible spectrum of its light, and I can feel the warmth of its rays on my skin. But I cannot see, and I cannot immediately feel, the ultraviolet radiation that is also emitted by the sun, and that also impinges upon my body. As Whitehead puts it, the human body is causally affected by the ultraviolet rays of the solar spectrum in ways which do not issue in any sensation of color. Nevertheless, Whitehead continues, such rays produce a decided emotional effect. Indeed, I largely experienced this sort of radiation in retrospect on the following day when I wake up and discover that I have been sunburned. Even worse, if the sun's ultraviolet radiation has caused mutations in one or more of my skin cells, I may not sense it or know about it until years later when a cancerous tumor develops on my skin. In an article that has been appended to the Korean translation of Discognition, I argue that we do not experience the world only by perceiving it. Rather, perception is itself a subset of a broader category, that of the ways that my mind and my body are affected or influenced by things that exist outside me, regardless of whether or not I am aware of them. In addition to all this, or as a result of all this, my feelings and experiences of the world outside me are never complete. There are always aspects of the people and things I encounter that I do not actually discover or reach, let alone understand. Leibniz says that the soul is like a mirror. The whole world is mirrored in me and thereby represented to me. The entire universe affects each monad and thereby is reflected in each monad. But Leibniz tells us that most of these reflections are obscure and confused. I can only apprehend a tiny portion of the world clearly. Everything else appears to be in a form that is murky, fragmentary, and scrambled. Whitehead makes a similar point. I can properly trace how a few particular things in the world affect me through the workings of what Whitehead calls presentational immediacy. But most of the time, my experience rather takes the form of what Whitehead calls causal efficacy. In this mode, Whitehead writes, experience is vague, haunting, unmanageable, heavy with the context of things gone by, which lay their grip on our immediate selves. For Leibniz, only God, if he exists, has a clear and distinct perception of the entire universe. Whitehead goes further and suggests that even God's understanding is belated. It only comes about after the fact. Both thinkers warn us that we can never attain such clarity and completeness for ourselves. Whatever the case may be with God, everyone else and everything else is finite. As finite, self-enclosed, and self-delimited monads, we can only imperfectly grasp the infinitude of the universe. Every particular point of view is partial. I use this word in the double sense that it has in English. To be partial means to be incomplete, fragmentary, rather than whole or integral. But in a second meaning, to be partial also means in English to be biased or prejudiced, to take sides, to be partisan rather than even-handed and neutral. Our cognition is inevitably partial in both of these senses. No finite being is able to attain either a divine view from everywhere or an objective scientific view from nowhere, to use a phrase from the philosopher Thomas Nagel. There are always multiple perspectives on the world, and all of them are incomplete. As finite beings, we have no way to get beyond this situation. Such perspectivism is one of my major concerns in Discognition. In each chapter, I take up texts that explore how one or another entity might see the world and how their perspective might be different from ours. What might happen, for instance, if a computational expert system, a sort of domain-specific artificial intelligence, or to develop some form of sentience? Or how might intelligent aliens experience the world if they were strategically smarter and technologically more sophisticated than we are, but without the burden of what we call consciousness? Or again, how far could human consciousness be manipulated by invasive technological means? Or again, how do the organisms known as plasmodial slime molds, in scientific terminology, Myxogastria or Myxomycetes, perceive and respond to the world? In all these cases, we are faced with perspectives that are different from the baseline human ones that we take for granted. The authors of these texts endeavor to translate such unfamiliar perspectives into terms that we are able to grasp. The second concept that I am taking from Leibniz is the idea of possible worlds. Just as many perspectives on the actual world necessarily coexist, so too the actual world is not the only conceivable one. It can be compared with other possible worlds. These are worlds that do not actually exist, but that could exist. Not only are such other worlds logically possible, we can also imagine scenarios through which they might actually come into existence. This is something that Leibniz and other philosophers do, but it is also something that science fiction writers do. Science fiction does not claim to actually predict the future. Instead, it explores what complexity theorists would call the possibility space of futurity. Science fiction looks at various ways in which our actual world situation might be transformed over the course of time. Science fiction is not about what will happen, but about what could happen. It posits alternative worlds that post-date, extend beyond, and depart from, but that are at least potentially capable of rising out of the actual world in which it is written and read. There is one stumbling block in Leibniz's doctrine of possible worlds. According to Leibniz, God chose one particular world, the actual world that we live in, from a multitude of possible ones. He made this particular choice, Leibniz insists, because the world we live in here and now is in fact, quote, the best of all possible worlds. God would not have chosen it otherwise, Leibniz says. Already in his own time and all the way to today, Leibniz has been criticized and indeed mocked for this hyperbolic claim. Most notably, the French Enlightenment writer Voltaire, in his novel Candide from 1759, ridicules Leibniz in the figure of Professor Pangloss, who repeatedly claims in the face of the most horrific catastrophes that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. More judiciously, but still disapprovingly, Alfred North Whitehead characterizes Leibniz's claim that the actual world is the best as an audacious fudge produced in order to save the face of a creator constructed by contemporary and antecedent theologians. If we do not have the ulterior motive of saving God from blame, Whitehead says, then we must recognize that the course of events presents itself with a character of being merely given. It does not disclose any peculiar character of perfection. That is to say, we never start out with a clean slate. Possibility is always constrained by what has come before, what is already given to us. Not everything is possible. Even God himself cannot escape this limitation. This means, according to Whitehead, that, and this is another quote, the function of God is analogous to the remorseless working of things in Greek and in Buddhist thought. The initial aim is the best for that impasse, but if the best be bad, then the ruthlessness of God can be personified as Ate, the goddess of mischief. The chaff is burnt. For Whitehead, Leibniz's best has no moral connotations. It rather means something like what physicists call the principle of least action. To give a simple example, when water is trickling down a hill, it will follow the most efficient path to do so. It is only in this sense that the world finds the best path out of an impasse. As for Leibniz, although he does also have moral considerations in mind, his primary meaning for the best of all possible worlds seems to mean the one that is the most complex and the most aesthetically rewarding. Leibniz lived during the Baroque period of art and architecture in Western Europe, and his aesthetic sense is very much a Baroque one, as numerous commentators, most famously Gilles Deleuze, have pointed out. One standard definition of the Baroque aesthetic says that it is characterized by its melodramatic tableaus, lavish ornamentation, use of deep colors, chiaroscuro, and asymmetry. Another standard definition describes the Baroque as using contrast, movement, exuberant detail, deep color, grandeur, and surprise to achieve a sense of awe. When Leibniz claims that ours is the best of all possible worlds, He means that our world is the most colorful, convoluted, and grandiose one that could possibly exist. In 21st century terms, Leibniz's claim is much like that of a physicist who finds a theory of subatomic particles to be beautiful and elegant and sees these qualities as evidence for its truth. Nonetheless, in order to avoid misunderstandings, I am happy to say against Leibniz that the world we live in today is self-evidently not the best. Rather, we must retain our faith that, as the ultra-globalization protesters like to say, another world is possible. We want a world in which everyone is guaranteed a basic level of material well-being, comfort, and self-determination. Beauty and excitement would come along with that. And we know that building such a world is entirely within our present capabilities, except for the fact that it is resisted by the wealthy and the powerful, which may well be an insurmountable obstacle. But in any case, I do not think that my concern for a better world is at odds with Leibniz's thought, for even my sense that another world is possible relies upon Leibniz's basic insight about the multiplicity of possible worlds. Leibniz allows us to consider which sorts of alternative world arrangements are achievable and which are not. Leibniz's notion of possible worlds rejects the two extremes of strict determinism on the one hand and sheer indeterminism on the other. Strict determinism is the idea that everything necessarily happens according to strict physical laws. If this were the case, then everything that happens was predetermined right from the beginning. Circumstances have to be precisely the way they are now. As the American physicist Sean Carroll states this doctrine, Carroll says, each moment in the progression of time follows from the previous moment according to clear, impersonal, quantitative rules. If this were the case, then the only possible world would be the actual one. Rigid chains of cause and effect would both lead up to the present moment and proceed from it for all eternity. It would then be entirely empty and idle to imagine anything that did not follow precisely from what already exists. The opposite extreme, however, seems to be just as dubious. The French speculative realist philosopher Quentin Meillassoux argues for what he calls hyperchaos, a situation in which any cause may actually produce any effect whatsoever, and in which the same cause may actually bring about 100 different events and even many more. For Meillassoux, our world is ultimately one of surrealistic randomness, in which at any moment elephants might fly in defiance of all we know about thermodynamics, and the salt water of the oceans of the world might be transformed into delicious lemonade. Indeed, I've chosen these deliberately. The first of these scenarios is dramatized in Dr. Seuss's delightful children's book, Horton Hatches the Egg from 1940. And the latter, The Sea Turning to Lemonade, is envisioned by the utopian philosopher Charles Fourier in his Theory of the Four Movements, originally published in 1808. Both of these authors, however, provide causal explanations for such happenings. Even if these explanations are entirely fictional and not scientifically valid, according to our current understanding, they still lay claim to some sort of consistent imaginative and narrative logic. In sharp contrast to Meillassoux' assertion that anything can happen without there being either a cause or a reason for this behavior. Meillassoux rejects narrative causality in the same way and for the same reason that he rejects scientific or physical causality. Imagination is therefore as idle and empty for Meillassoux as it is for a strict determinist. It is not surprising that in one of his books, Meillassoux explicitly rejects science fiction, preferring fictional worlds in which the laws of nature are purely and simply abolished, and in which events take place that no real or imaginary logic can explain. But Meillassoux himself concedes that such a form of narrative is quite uncommon, and that even at best it would be probably unreadable. The idea of possible worlds is useful for science fiction because it equally rejects the opposed extremes of strict determinism and radical indeterminism. Another world is possible, but not just any other world. There are many circumstances that are possible in the abstract, in the sense that they do not involve a logical contradiction, but that nonetheless will never actually happen. Meillassoux, like the American analytic philosopher David Lewis, maintains that the world is radically contingent, and that anything not excluded on the grounds of logical contradiction might well happen. But this seems at odds with nearly all human experience, past and present. Leibniz, like Meillassoux and Lewis, upholds the principle of non-contradiction, which asserts that a statement that its denial cannot both be true at the same time. But Leibniz adds to this what he calls the principle of sufficient reason, which he states as follows: we can find no true or existent fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason for why it is thus and not otherwise. That is to say, even if nothing is entirely predetermined, And when something does take place, it has happened for a particular reason. This must necessarily be the case, even if, Leibniz says, most of the time these reasons cannot be known to us. This means that not everything that is logically possible is thereby existentially possible. Things do not always fit together. For Leibniz, it is not enough that any particular thing is possible in and of itself. It must always so be able to coexist in the same world with other things. Different circumstances also need to be compossible with one another. This extension of the principle of non-contradiction from abstract logic to actual worldly situations is another one of Leibniz's philosophical innovations. In insisting upon compossibility, Leibniz gives us the beginnings of what today we call an environmental ecological mode of understanding. For Leibniz, compossibility is due to what he calls a pre-established harmony between the monads imposed by God. But modern thinkers like Whitehead argue that such harmony can arise imminently in real time, simply through what he calls the mutual adaptation of the several factors in an occasion of experience. Things persist in being by accommodating themselves to one another and by exchanging elements without merging. Evolution in real time is enough to account for compossibility without the need for God to arrange everything in advance. Here is an example of compossibility or actual non-contradiction. All life on Earth is water and carbon-based. Life as we know it requires water in liquid form, and this constrains the physical condition in which it can exist. And I quote here from a website, the highest known temperature at which metabolism and growth can still occur in water is 122 degrees Celsius. For example, at high pressure hydrothermal vents, the lowest temperature seems to be about minus 18 degrees Celsius. So those are the limits within which life is possible. In contrast to this, we must presume that water-based life does not exist on the surface of the planet Venus, where the temperature is 464 degrees Celsius, and the atmospheric pressure is 92 times that on the Earth's surface. In other words, life as we know it in Venusian climate conditions are not mutually compossible. If there is life on the surface of Venus, it must have an entirely different chemical composition and organization than that of terrestrial life. Two scientists, Jan Spacek and Stephen Brenner, have recently proposed a scenario in which Venusian life could exist in the form of self-organizing and self-replicating droplets of what is called red oil, bathed in sulfuric acid. Such a sort of life would at least be compossible with Venusian conditions. The scientists who wrote this paper about potential life on Venus intended it as a thought experiment. They do not claim that such life forms actually exist. It is not wrong to regard such a scientific paper as a work of science fiction. There are many ways to define science fiction, but I would like to suggest that, among other things, it is the art of articulating compossible situations in order to compose possible worlds. This is what distinguishes science fiction from other closely related genres such as fantasy. Science fiction and fantasy are alike in that they both present worlds that are radically different from the real world that we inhabit. But the possible worlds of science fiction can be distinguished, at least in principle, from fantasy worlds, for which the question of possibility is not in the forefront. As the American TV producer Rod Serling once explained the difference, fantasy is the impossible made probable. Fantasy is the impossible made probable, while science fiction is improbable made possible. In this way, Leibniz's doctrine of possible worlds, worlds that are not only logically non-contradictory, but also situationally non-contradictory, or composed of compossible elements, is at the root of how I write about problems of cognition and consciousness and discognition. Each of the narratives I discuss not only projects a particular form and style of sentience, but also evokes a possible world or environment in which such sentience might be able to evolve and flourish. This world might be a corporate mainframe or computer gaming network, or it might be a high technology human world in which government intelligence services work to control and manipulate people in horrific ways. Or it might be a world circling another star in which evolution took a radically different course than it did on Earth. Or finally, it might be a water and carbon-based life form native to Earth, but whose particular physical environment requires modes of feeling and cognition that are barely comprehensible to us. This brings me to the third Leibniz concept that I mentioned, unity and diversity. The claim that Leibniz is deeply relevant to science fiction is not original with me. The American critic Richard Halperin suggests that Leibniz is not only a philosopher, but an early science fiction writer. And Halperin adds that Leibniz's philosophical writing has the kind of dense intellectual beauty that characterizes the writings of a Stanislav Lem or a Philip K. Dick or a Cixin Liu. Independently of Halperin, the French philosopher Guy Lardreau wrote an entire book, Philosophical Fictions and Science Fiction, tracing what he calls the astonishing homology between the fictions deployed by Leibniz in order to explain his ideas about possible worlds and the way that science fiction imagines its own parallel worlds. Of course, this parallelism is not a strictly historical one. Nothing that we now call science fiction existed in the literature of Leibniz's own time. There were fantastical stories, to be sure. They were closer to what we now call fantasy or else to farce and satire than to anything that we call science fiction today. Leibniz, however, was one of the most forward thinkers of his own time. He already had a deep grasp of what we now call thought experiments, even though this concept did not properly exist in his time. The German terms Gedankenexperiment and Gedankenversuch are first attested nearly a whole century after Leibniz's death. The concept is already present in Leibniz's practice, even if it's not overtly theorized. Often we must deploy fictional assertions and trace out their consequences in order to develop ideas of scientific and philosophical import. Today, philosophers themselves do this, as I discussed in the first chapter of this cognition, where I look at what the philosophers of mind call the story of Mary. But science fiction writing engages in this sort of activity too, and often on a broader and bolder scale than is the case with strictly philosophical writing. In any case, philosophical thought experiments and science fictional fabulation are able to address non-fictional questions because they adhere to the Leibnizian principle of unity and diversity. However odd and unprecedented the circumstances we find in a philosophical fiction or in a science fictional narrative, they are intelligible to the extent that the circumstances they depict are compossible with those that we are already familiar with. A number of scholars have traced Leibniz's fascination with the fantastic literature of his own time. Lardreau, Halperin, and a third critic, Justin E.H. Smith, all note how Leibniz especially likes to cite the commedia dell'arte figure of Harlequin, as he is presented in the French farce Harlequin, Emperor of the Moon, by Noland de Fatouville, first performed in Paris in 1684. In this stage place, Harlequin, as Emperor of the Moon, describes at great length what life on the moon is like. His descriptions are all satirical, making fun of targets that would have been familiar to the original Parisian audience. Within the play, the other characters remark in response to every description given by Harlequin, c'est tout comme ici, it's all as it is here. Leibniz refers to this play when he writes, my great principle of natural things is that of Harlequin, Emperor of the Moon, that it is always and everywhere in all things just as it is here. In other words, even on the moon, and even when a ridiculous clown is emperor, the way that things work in order to hang together and to make sense is no different from what we are accustomed to in everyday life. The unity of the logic of connections brings together the widest imaginable diversity of things, events, and manners of being. This is why fictions can inform us about reality. Satire only hits its target if it both resembles and estranges the situation being satirized. A plausible or even simply legible fictional world must follow the same logic or the same principles of connection and variation as the actual world we live in does. This is perhaps why science fiction follows traditional canons of representation in its texts, even though the content being thus represented is imaginary or counterfactual. To conclude, all this is why I say in this cognition that science fiction embodies philosophical issues in characters and narratives, endeavoring to work through the weirdest and most extreme ramifications of these scenarios and to imagine what it would be like if they were true. Science fiction is a way not of predicting the future, but precisely of taking up and exploring a futurity whose contents we cannot know and which may include exceedingly strange situations. Traditional philosophy scrutinizes the grounds of social and metaphysical hypotheses, probing for flaws in their underlying premises. In contrast, science fiction looks at the consequences of such hypotheses, tracking their potential developments over the course of time. This is what science fiction at its best does, and this is what I am trying to do as I draw out the implications of science fiction texts in my own book. Thank you.
네, 강의 감사히 잘 들었습니다. 그 앞에서 이제 제일 먼저 시작하실 때 번역이라고 하는 것이 어떤 의미인지 번역에 대해서 말씀을 해주신 게 되게 인상적이었는데요. 그러니까 단순히 활자를 통해서 정보를 전달하는 그런 행위라기보다 일종의 마주침의 일종인 것이고, 그리고 그런 마주침들마다의 잉여, 그리고 어떤 정동들, 이런 것에 대해서 앞에서 이제 좀 그 얘기를 운을 띄워주신 것 같습니다. 그리고 SF라고 하는 장르를 라이프니츠까지 소급을 해서 그 원리와 의미에 대해서 이 얘기를 해주신 것은 사실 이 책에는 없는 내용인데 아마도 이 강연을 위해서 특별히 준비해 주신 내용인 거라는 생각이 듭니다. 또 한편에 굉장히 좋은 그 논문을 읽은 것 같은, 들려주신 것 같은 그런 생각이 듭니다. 시간이 조금 이제 쉴 시간이 지체가 되었다라기보다 쉬어야 할 시간이 된 것 같아서 10분 정도 쉰 이후에 그리고 이제 본격적으로 이 강의와 관련된 이야기를 나누어 보면 좋겠습니다. 지금 11시 43분인데요. 53분에 다시 이 자리에 모여주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 네, 53분에 뵙겠습니다.